Well, here's the deal. In 1989, so 10 years after these scientific investigations began, 3 labs took a sample from the shroud. This is all kind of stemming from the same scientific effort to try and authenticate the shroud. And they tried to do carbon dating. So this is what happened. They took a sample from one part of the shroud. They sent out that thread to 3 different labs, one in Oxford, one in Tucson, and one in Zurich. Right? Each of these labs conducted a different test, and then they combined their data and says that it is a 13th century piece of cloth. Couldn't have been from the 1st century, couldn't have wrapped Jesus' body. So regardless of how mysterious the image is, we've got a huge problem here. And this testing had newspaper articles published, and a lot of people lost faith in the shroud and lost interest in the shroud and just kind of couldn't understand how it was done, but decided it must be a fake because the shroud is just way too young. It's not old enough to have existed during Jesus' time. But here's the thing, and even today, people just assume that the shroud is a forgery, but there has been new science that has come out, and you can imagine people were really attached to the shroud. They didn't want to give it up. So they started looking into this. Could there be a reason why the carbon dating is wrong? There are a lot of mysterious things about this shroud. It does appear to be Jesus in a lot of ways, and it has this weird holographic thing. How can we explain it? There's something about this that people couldn't let go. And to some extent, I would say, thank goodness that they didn't, because here's what they found. First of all, the labs used a bad sample. The sample that they used, it's known as the Reyes sample. It came from a corner of the shroud that used to, first of all, be handled all the time by priests when they would, and bishops and stuff, when they would display it in the Middle Ages. They would hold it from that part of the shroud. Hand oils can mess up carbon dating, okay, first of all. Second of all, when they took the spectrographic image of the shroud, there's a huge discoloration right over the patch where they took the shroud. Like it was something about that corner was lit up differently on this test than every other part of the corner. So it was like not a very, it wasn't a very representative piece. It was a very weird area for some reason. And that is exactly where they took that from. And then here's the real clincher, all right? A husband and wife team noticed that the area where the shroud had a sample taken from it was an area that had been torn and looks like expertly rewoven together. And you could tell by looking at the fibers very carefully and noticing that some of them have a slight different coloration than the others. And tests that have since been done have confirmed that there's dye and coloring there, which suggests that what happened was nuns in the 16th century saw that there was a tear and very prayerfully, carefully, tenderly tried to repair and put a patch into this corner of the shroud. And then very carefully to try and make the patch blend in, put a little bit of coloration on there so that the cotton fibers would match the linen fibers in color. Well, cotton is, you can find that in the Middle Ages, but it's going to throw off carbon dating, and it's going to completely change the analysis 100%, right? If you're mixing ancient fibers with modern fibers and then you conduct a carbon reading on that, it's totally going to be off. So there's huge problems with the carbon-14 dating, which throws the question of, well, then how old is this shroud really? People have proposed and tried to use these 4 new dating methods. All right, one was a vanillin test. There were 2 spectroscopic analyses, and then they checked the compressibility and breaking strength of the material. And putting these tests together, they were able to determine a midpoint average of 50 AD plus or minus 200 years with a 96% confidence level. Boom. 1st century, right? 50 AD plus or minus 200. That's exactly where this shroud should be if it's from the 1st century. Those results show that the carbon dating was wrong. But there's more. Remember the tests they did on the pollen and the soil samples? Well, they found that the pollen on the shroud was from a whole bunch of different places. And each of the places where that pollen can be found on the planet Earth, the vegetation that forms in each of those places, is consistent with the records that we have of where the shroud traveled. So it would have started in Jerusalem, that Jesus was buried there, and then it was taken out and it was moved to different parts of Europe and then wound up in Turin, Italy. Well, the pollen that we see comes from the geographical regions where we have evidence that the shroud would have traveled. Think about this. A medieval forger somehow anticipates that we're going to need to get pollen, right? This is scientific thinking here. In a pre-scientific time, I'm going to need to go find the correct pollen from the correct plants in the correct places. And then imagine, like, you can't hop on an airplane. You're going to, get on a camel? Like, how much effort would have had to been put into making this? Could one person have even done all of this? And then sprinkle pollen from all the right places over the shroud, hoping that someday in the future, scientists would care and scientists would know about pollen enough to be able to tell that it came from all those places. No medieval forger would it wouldn't even cross their mind. It makes no sense. They don't even know that pollen is different from one plant to another. They don't know how to examine something under a microscope. So to anticipate, well, maybe someday someone will be able to. It's impossible. Yeah, just check. This is just a visual chart. This is one of the plants that was found. It's found only in Jerusalem. And notice the thorny pieces here. Some think that maybe this was actually the plant that was used for the crown of thorns. And just take a look at the chart here. You can see that there are some from plants of the desert, most frequently found in the Dead Sea. Plant from the deserts, frequent in South Palestine. Plants of semi-deserts, most frequent in the east of Jerusalem, right? So pretty compelling evidence from the location that this was taken from. Another cool thing, people have zoomed in, and this is slightly more controversial. There are people on both sides of this one, but people have zoomed in on the eyes of the image of the shroud. And some believe that they can see coins. And in fact, when you do the 3D relief of the image, it does look like there are two flat, round discs on the eyes. And so people thought, these must be coins. And there is some evidence that there were tradition in Jewish and other ancient circles of putting coins on the eyes to weigh the lids down so that they wouldn't open. Now, if they put coins on Jesus's eyes, that would be really remarkable to find evidence of that on the shroud. It seems that we may have found that evidence. So if you take a look at the image here, here's a close-up of the right eye. And you can kind of see the edge of a circle here. And then there's this little faint sort of imprint thing here. And then some markings here. It's hard to distinguish between the edge of what might be a coin and, just the texture of the fabric itself, which is very coarse. Okay? But if you look here, you can see kind of a little bit of an enhancement of what those shapes appear to be. And then here's some more contrast. And then finally, this just highlights exactly the area that seems to match, right? And if you just take the dark blue parts from this area here and you look at them isolated and compare them now to this coin that was minted by Pontius Pilate in Judea in the 1st century. Extremely rare coins, and the year on these coins is like 29 AD or 30 AD or 31 AD, and Jesus was crucified in 33 AD. So, it is extremely rare type of information that no middle-aged person would have any way of knowing, right? What catalog, what internet would they search to find, well, what did the coins look like that, Pontius Pilate minted back in... No, right? And so that's remarkable on the right eye. But, sometimes you can see what you want to see in these images. And it is very coarse. Maybe somebody's just really stretching it, and these coins aren't as precise as a modern day coin where the stamp is impossible to mess up. You can see, it's kind of ugly and sloppy, right? So maybe we're just seeing what we want to see, all right? But then we look at the left eye, and the left eye also seems to have this faint image in it here that's consistent with the shape that's found on a different Pontius Pilate type coin. I don't know. If it was one of these things taken by itself, maybe you could start to doubt that this shroud is authentic, right? But all of these things taken together, they build on one another to make the case in my mind, extremely strong that this is Jesus, that this is from the first century. And to me, I also believe this bizarre flash of holographic light information. I mean, if I was looking for, I would think it would be too good to be true that there could be any sort of scientific evidence that the body of Jesus went through some supernatural thing. But what is the definition of supernatural if not something that's beyond nature's ability to do, something that's beyond humans on planet Earth with technology to do? To me, that is a definition of supernatural. And if Jesus did rise from the dead, maybe God willed that some little piece of miraculous evidence could be left behind for curious scientific minds like yours and mine in an era in the future, right? Only God could have anticipated the need for this kind of support to your faith. In case that's not enough, I've got some more for you. By the way, each of the slides that I have here has got links to the places where I'm getting my information, because your opinion is only as good as the evidence that backs it up. And I'm sharing this slideshow with you so that you can take a look for yourself and make up your own mind about whether you find this evidence compelling or not. Okay, we're almost there to the end of the video. You guys have been good hanging in so far with me. And I hope that you're curious and enjoying this a little bit. All right, so here's the last thing that I want to draw your attention to in this video. Check out this image. Notice how on the right-hand side, there's a separate cloth. When we read that scripture passage, we saw that there were two cloths that were supposed to be on Jesus's body. Do we have the other one? Is that too much to hope for? Well, turns out if you go to Oviedo, Spain, you can find what is called the sardarium, or basically the head napkin of Oviedo. And this is claimed to be that other piece of cloth. Let's do some science on it. First of all, it belonged to a crucified man, verified by the same chemicals that are found on the shroud that are found on this head napkin. Pretty remarkable if it's some sort of a forgery. Okay. Next, the blood type on the shroud is AB. Blood type on the sudarium, AB. These medieval forgers are great scientists. They know about blood types before we, the rest of the world, had even heard that there was such a thing. They can figure out how this head napkin was wrapped around the head. So this is how it would have worked. The body, maybe even while it was still on the cross, might have had this hood placed over the head. It was against Jewish law to show the face of somebody who had been really badly disfigured in a burial, so they might have put this over his head, lowered him down from the cross. The reason for the narrative I'm telling you right now is based on the chemicals we see here. There are 3 different levels of stains that seem like the body was moved, and then there are more fluids that came out, and then the body was moved again, and then it sat and we can estimate the amount of time. So we can actually use this head napkin to kind of tell exactly bit by bit what happened as Jesus was taken down from the cross. Assuming that this is Jesus, of course. Now, because of the way that this would have been wrapped around the head, we can tell where the nose was relative to all the other parts of the body, and we can measure it. Well, the length of the nose on the sudarium is the exact length of the nose on the shroud. Okay, pretty cool. The next thing to bear in mind is we check this for pollen samples. Same pollen grains that are found only in Jerusalem match the shroud exactly. We also noticed that the wounds on the neck of the Sidarium match the wounds on the neck of the shroud. And they're actually, if you line up how the Sidarium was around the head with the markings that are on the shroud, you can see that there are all these points of coincidence. They match exactly where the blood would have been pouring out if it was around the same head. There are in total 70 points of coincidence with the shroud on the front and 50 points on the rear. That is remarkable, right? And again, beyond the capabilities of any sort of a medieval forger to fake. So it seems like both of these came from the same man who was crucified. Now, here's another question. Is the same image that's on the shroud on this? Did the face, flash of light, leave the same image? The answer is no, but that actually makes sense because it's, as the scriptures tell us, right, it was rolled up in another place in another part of the tomb. It was separate from the cloth. It's likely that when they got Jesus to the tomb, his head wasn't bleeding as much, so they didn't need the Sidarium. They took it off of his head and put it down. And that's consistent with everything that we find on the Sidarium, right? And then he was then wrapped in the linen, and then when he resurrected, the Sidarium wasn't around his head, which is why the image was left directly on the shroud. So what do you think about this? Did you know that there was so much science behind this relic? Do you think that it belonged to Jesus? Do you think that it was actually... Do you think that it shows evidence that Jesus rose from the dead in some sort of a brilliant, flashing